So without much delay, I would like to introduce our next speaker of the session and the final session, Ashish Kothariji, who has been very patiently waiting here. So Ashish Kothariji began working on environment and development issues in his school days in 1978 and 79 as one of the co-founders of Kalpavriksha. Currently, he coordinates its program on alternatives. He has been co-chair of the IUCN Intercommission Strategic Direction on Governance, Equity and Livelihoods in relation to protected areas from 1999 to 2008, and a former member of the steering committees of the World Commission on Protected Areas. He has served on the board of directors of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India. Ashish ji has served on the Indian government's Environmental Appraisal Committee on River Valley projects and expert committees to formulate India's Biological Diversity Act and National Wildlife Action Plan. He was co-coordinator of the Activist Academy Co-Generation of Knowledge on Environmental Justice Acknowledge Global Project. Ashish ji has been active with a number of people's movements, including Narmada Bachao Andolan and campaigns on forest rights against mega projects. He helps coordinate the Vikalp Sangam or the Alternatives Confluence process in India and the global tapestry of alternatives globally. He is also the author and editor of over 30 books, including Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures, and Pluriverse. Ashish ji, we are honored to have you here with us today. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Puneet. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, Puneet, Devjit, everybody at Living Farms, Grain, and RLS for this opportunity. And I was very happy to hear Paul and Regina also briefly over the last half an hour or 45 minutes. Hi, Paul. And hello to, I see a number of familiar faces or names here. So hello to everybody here. So I think given that we're already about 40 minutes over time, for good reason, because you were listening to two of the most experienced activist researchers in India. So I don't grudge that at all. But given that we are already 40 minutes over, I think I will jump straight into the presentation. I'll speak about maybe 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can have a hopefully an hour or so of discussion, depending on how much time is left. I'm very sorry I wasn't in the session yesterday, and much of today I was out in, there's a place called Bhima Shankar close to Pune where we work with a few of the Adivasi villages. So I was there. This was actually my first trip out of Pune in the last 8 months. Also, I think some of what I'm going to say may be a bit of a repetition, because if people like Debel and Regina, Paul, and others yesterday, including our young activist friends, have spoken, it's very possible that some of what I'm going to deal with has already been dealt with by adequately by them, probably better than I could speak about, especially issues of social injustice, climate injustice, and so on. So I'll try and not repeat what I think may already have happened. Puneet, I'm going to try and share screen, so let me know whether this works.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, we can see that.
Is it full screen?
It is full screen. Can you just change the slide so we can test if that is happening?
Working?
Yeah, working. And also, please take as much time as you need.
Okay.
Yeah, here.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is maybe do about 15-20 minutes or even shorter of the bad news, which is all the sort of injustice and unsustainability that is taking place, to provide a context to the rest of the presentation, which will be a much larger, longer focus on radical alternatives, on some of the kinds of struggles for justice and ecological wisdom, etc., that are taking place in India, but also examples from outside India. And on the basis of those examples, try and draw out some sort of frameworks of what are the kinds of radical, more just societies that people are trying to envision and struggle and fight towards. And there's a deliberate reason I'm calling this a rainbow recovery from the current global crises, and I'll come back to that later on. So, very quick background on what, as I said, the bad news. We all know that there's one picture of India that's being promoted by the government and corporations and by our developmental economists and so on, which is of India having rapidly moved into the 21st century, also becoming now the fifth largest economy in the world and kind of becoming an economic superpower, and developing at very fast rate, etc. So this is the dominant image that is coming out from these sectors, and including much of what comes out in the media. But we also know, and this is, I'm sure, something you all heard yesterday and today, is that there is the other side of the picture, which is normally hidden or gets very little media attention, and of course very little government attention, which is the violence that this form of economic growth and development has caused and the ideology of developmentality or developmentalism. Debel must have, I'm sure, spoken about that earlier, which is really about saying that if humans have to progress, if humans have to be developed, and anything that's in the way, whether it is the rest of nature, like you see in this image, or it is communities, or it's cultures, or whatever it is, a so-called primitivity, that all has to be displaced and replaced with a certain form of modernity and growth and economic development. And that has meant an enormous amount of violence to all species on Earth, including to marginalized communities such as the ones that Paul and Regina have spoken about. We know that globally this has meant already we are in a number of ways crossing several planetary boundaries, which is what the climate crisis is about, but also the loss of biodiversity, the hydrological crisis, etc. These are all things that are kind of familiar. There's a lot of news and information, so I'm not going into any detail on this. If somebody wants, we can kind of have a discussion later. Interestingly, a study more than 10 years back done with the collaboration of the Confederation of Indian Industries, and that's why I'm saying interestingly, also showed that India also was already unsustainable in its development path. We were already using twice the biological capacity that we can actually afford to use. Now, one of the arguments that we've always been given, I know that when I was growing up in school, I was always told that yes, there is some ecological damage, yes, there's some displacement, but we need this in order to move people out of poverty and to create jobs and livelihoods and so on. So a colleague and I actually a few years back had done a very detailed study looking at mostly, in fact, government data to actually see whether this form of development was creating substantial new jobs, especially jobs that are secure, and or removing poverty. And again, I'm not going into any detail, but our analysis in very great detail shows that, in fact, it has been what's called jobless growth, which is to say that other than in the informal sector, in the formal sector itself, very few net new jobs are being created, because whatever new job is created is displaced somewhere else by mechanization and automation. And of course, the 90% of the Indian workforce still remains in the informal sector, which, as we know, is extremely vulnerable, as made very obvious in the COVID crisis. In addition, 60 million people, that's larger than the population of most countries, have been physically displaced, uprooted from their homes, and displaced by so-called development projects like mining, big dams, expressways, industries, etc. All of this has got highlighted significantly in the COVID period, especially, like I said, the insecurity of people's livelihoods in the informal or the unorganized sectors, and where people are still relevant, still related to, still dependent on nature and natural resources, and those are also snatched away. Then also life becomes very insecure. The other major impact of this form of economic development, especially globalized economic development across the world, has been inequality. Humanity today is more unequal than ever before in history. This has been shown by a number of studies. Globally and in India also, the gap between the rich and the poor has just risen in the last, especially the last 3.5 decades, such that now 5% of Indians earn as much as the rest of the 95%. And such that in a country with so much poverty, And in a city like Mumbai, with 40% of its people living in slums, we have the world's largest single family house owned by India's richest man, whom I'm sure you know. We have also seen that this process of development has meant shrinking democracy, because when governments are hell-bent to have certain forms of economic, certain rates of economic growth, and there's a competition amongst all the nation states to do that, then anything that stands in the way has to go, which means that if there is dissent, if there are people who protest, if there are people who say we don't want to give our land, or civil society which tries to raise its voice, then the state comes down very heavily, as we have seen repeatedly in the last many decades, but especially in the last few years, of how people are being killed, being jailed, being harassed, being charged with all kinds of false accusations, etc. So this is the book which Asim and I did a few years back. There's 300 pages of this of detailed analysis on this. So if any of you wants to get more depressed than you already might be, please pick up this book and read it. I don't recommend reading the first section because it is very depressing. But if you want to get much more analysis, then please go ahead. And the last point I make here is about this last 8 months, which has been such an incredibly um, completely unpredictable and unpredicted period in human history. 8 months of more or less, or at least 5 or 6 months of economic shutdown almost across the world, and still repercussions of it across the world, including in India. Now, what we see in this period is broadly two directions that people are taking. One is where many governments and corporations have used this as an excuse and an opportunity to become more authoritarian, more profit-seeking, more exploitative in their practices. And the other is where communities, especially local communities or civil society, and in some cases governments, have said, no, we need to re-examine the models of economic and political systems that we have, and to move towards models of much more solidarity, much more caring and sharing, and to sort of reduce the kind of vulnerability that we've seen. And it's the second thing which I want to focus on much more, to see what are the possibilities. But before I do that, I think it's very important to understand that when we talk about alternatives, it's very important for us to understand the structural roots, the relationships of inequality, etc., which are at the basis, at the foundation of the kind of problems and injustice that we see. And this is very important because right now, if we talk about climate, if we talk about environment, if we talk about biodiversity, if we talk about inequality, unemployment, poverty, etc., there are answers that the system is giving us. So if it's about climate, they're saying, okay, let's do carbon trading, which means people can continue to emit as much carbon as they want, but net zero carbon means somebody else somewhere is capturing it and sequestering it and saying, okay, then we're net zero. Or people are saying we'll do massive geoengineering projects around the whole earth, or fertilize the oceans, etc., so that the carbon is captured much more, or warmth is reduced in sort of technological ways. So there are techno fixes, there are managerial fixes, there are economic fixes, like people are saying, okay, let's just make sure that pollution is priced that much more or taxed that much more. What these kind of solutions do is they ignore the fundamental roots of the problem. It's a bit like saying, if I have a headache, let me just take a crocin, without trying to understand why do I have the headache and why do I have migraine in the first place. It could be something much deeper, which the crocin will only temporarily give me relief for. And in order to do that, and in order to see through the kinds of false solutions, or the kinds of eye-washing that is taking place all across the world, or in India, for instance, when in May this year, the Prime Minister announced the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the self-reliance package, with a great amount of fanfare, saying, COVID has made us realize that we need to be self-reliant from the village to the nation. But if you see the actual Atmanirbhar Bharat package, you'll see it's coal mining, it's about more commercialization, it's about more corporate sector coming into the economic activities, which in fact are what craftspersons or farmers or fishers or whatever have been doing, including the latest farm laws that have come in, against which we have seen such fantastic resistance. Um, and so in order to address this, we have to try and understand these structural roots. To put it very simply, and this is deliberately simple because of lack of time, the way I characterize it is that these issues are created by the concentration of power, the power to dominate, by men over women. And that's much, much older than something like capitalism. And I'm saying this deliberately because we tend to sometimes put all our eggs into the basket of capitalism. Uh, but it's many other structural factors also. Or it's statism from the time of empires sweeping across the globe and trying to take control, to the nation states right now, which are trying to hold power as in whatever way they can, including all kinds of electoral malpractices, to, of course, also capitalism, especially in the last 400 to 500 years of the colonial expansion and the many different ways in which capitalism is today controlling our lives, to casteism, which Paul and Regina have very rightly pointed out, ethnicism or racism, which affects, again, Adivasis, Dalits, and many other communities. Um, and in a way, kind of underlying all this also is the notion that human beings are at the center of the universe, that we are the ones who have the right, the moral right, to take decisions with regard to what to do with nature and natural resources, never mind what happens to the rest of nature. So in that sense, there is this sort of concentration of power by some over others, domination by some over others, which kind of underlies all of this. And so the search for alternatives needs to confront this. It needs to confront the factors by which these forces have these structures have kind of forced a certain notion of what it is to be civilized. Again, as Regina spoke about, how Adivasis have been treated. So we've thought of Adivasis as being uncivilized. They need to be brought into the mainstream and civilized. So what is the notion of developed? What is the notion of progress? What is the notion of what it is to be an expert? What food is worth eating? What language is worth talking about? What kind of building should we live in? What clothes are worth wearing? All of this is determined through a certain colonial and post-colonial lens, which has been imposed in the name of modernization, especially Western modernization, resulting in an enormous erosion and loss of cultural diversity, of knowledge systems, of biodiversity, of livelihoods. And I think the most important, the loss of confidence in people in their own abilities and their own knowledge, so that you can go to, including, I'm sure, I hope Regina would agree, that you can go to an Adivasi village in many parts of India today and they will say, humko vikas chahiye, sarkar hame vikas nahi de rahi hai, the government is not giving us development. Instead of saying, no, we actually have the ability to continue living the way we are, or to create new ways of living with our own confidence, our own knowledge, etc. And where we've seen movements, which is what I'll talk about, of that, that's exactly the reassertion of confidence and skill and knowledge that creates the alternatives. So finally, then, in all of this, one of the, to my mind, what's happened in these last few hundred years, and especially the last few decades, is a movement from livelihoods, which were in some senses kind of, it was not jobs. These were occupations that were linked to culture, linked to ecology, linked to society, to now what we have is deadlihoods, which is the killing off of huge numbers of livelihoods, especially in the so-called primary sector, but also the creation of jobs which are delinked from the rest of your life, which is why we have this phenomenon of the weekend and the weekday. We never had it in any traditional society, but Western society says, oh, 5 days work, 2 days enjoyment. Why can't work itself be enjoyment is something that is not questioned in this. And so I call this a move from livelihoods to deadlihoods in many different ways. All right, let me now move to what I think is the kind of more hopeful, more positive signs of transformation. I think there's two aspects to this. One is about resistance movements. This picture is from about 30 years back, an Adivasi movement against two mega hydro projects, Bhopalpatnam and Champalli, that were to come up on the Indravati River in southern Maharashtra, and affecting, at that time, Madhya Pradesh, now Chhattisgarh. where the Adivasi movements were not just saying that we don't want these dams, they will displace our villages and destroy our livelihoods. That, of course, was part of the narrative. But the equally or more important part of the narrative was they were telling the government that when you see the river, you see megawatts power, electric power. When we see the river, it's our mother. You can see it's like a civilizational clash, which is so deep that it has to be fundamentally, it needs a fundamental transformation in society to resolve it. But what these movements of resistance, therefore, are telling us that so-called modernized development or developmentality or developmentalism is not the only way of thinking of the human project on earth. There are other ways of being, other ways of knowing, other ways of doing, other ways of dreaming, of envisioning, which you can see in many, many different resistance movements, including the more recent ones, the anti-racism movements in the US, the Calmers movement that is giving us a lot of hope, the youth climate justice movements, and many others around the world, which are in some sense or the other kind of challenging the modern notion of development and what it is to have a good life. Along with these movements of resistance, we are also seeing some of the most incredible practical and conceptual initiatives towards creating alternatives, towards creating solutions for what people's needs are, for poverty, for hunger, for unemployment, etc., etc. And I mean, we could spend many hours and many days on the kind of examples that are there. I'll show you a book later on where we have 100 examples of these radical alternatives. I'm just going to give you a few examples over the next few minutes. And by the way, those of you who are a little disoriented by this map because you think it's upside down, I think it's very important for us to remember that the so-called normal map, which had Europe on top and Europe looked much bigger than it actually is, was a project of colonial times. It was deliberately made like that. And so in that sense, even things like maps, just like language and so on, are things that are products of coloniality. And we have to decolonize our minds to even understand that. I'm, of course, much more familiar with examples from India, from the South Asian context. So I'll give you many of those, but I'll also talk about some from other parts of the world. Oops, sorry. So we have been, through Kalpavriksha, the Vikalp Sangam process, which I'll mention at the end, we've been trying to help document and support a number of these alternative initiatives in different parts of India. And a website I'll show you later has about 1,500 stories of these, which you can look up. I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 of them. One of the ones that I find really, really inspiring is of the 4,000 plus Dalit women farmers and a few pastoral Adivasi farmers, women farmers in Telangana, in about 75 villages, who, because they were Dalits and because they were women and because they were small and marginal farmers, were facing a triple situation of disprivilege and marginalization about 30 years back, when they have organized themselves over the last 2.5, 3 decades into Mahila Sanghas, women Sanghas, and across that into a federation, which is the Deccan Development Society, where they have brought back their traditional diversity of seeds and of jawar, bajra, ragi, and others, rice, etc., have collectivized a lot of their operations, have created grain banks in each of the villages, have created a local public distribution system, by which the local organic food can actually be provided very cheap to the poor families in those villages, and have created a situation of not just food security from a time when they faced hunger and poverty and malnutrition and so on, to having complete food security, but also what they call food sovereignty, Anna Swaraj, which means total control over everything to do with food, the seeds, the water, the knowledge, the land, including fighting for land rights for the women, which is very, very unusual in India. There's a lot more that can be said about this. They've created their own community media station. India's first community radio station was made by them at a time when it was illegal. They make their own films and much else. And through all of this, they've actually significantly transformed their lives as women and Dalits into a situation of much more dignity than what they faced earlier. And remarkably, the same people who were hungry themselves and malnourished are today, in the COVID period, able to provide food for relief efforts in district for those who don't have enough food. Similar movement in Northeast India, a women's network called Northeast Network, which has been working in Nagaland and a couple of other states, trying to sustain and revive local traditions of farming, which are biologically extremely diverse and sustainable and so on, but also which provide women the agency and the control over land and food. And again, this is an example where they were able to do much better in the COVID lockdown period, including working with the local administration to make sure that not just their own food security, but also they could provide food into places like Kohima town. This is another women's network, which is up in Munsiari in Uttarakhand, where they, about 2.5 decades back or so, they started with a movement against domestic violence against women and girls in houses. And from that very quickly moved into economic independent activities for the women or by the women, including some in the traditional sector, like making products out of wool, which was all their traditional skill already, but also in the modern sector like ecotourism, home-based ecotourism, but with their own rules and regulations, not something where you kind of do whatever it needs to attract the tourists, but to say, okay, tourists are welcome, but we will be giving them our own home food. They can come and see our own culture. They have to live the way we are living. And we will also take them around the forests and show them, so then also developing their own nature guides and their own alternative school called Jungli School, deliberately called Jungli School, because to do away with the kind of negative connotation of the word jungli, which unfortunately has come in our schools. Another example this time is from Kutch. These are Vankars or weavers, also belonging or used to belong to the Dalit community. They don't like saying that themselves, but they have faced discrimination, including untouchability in the past. Now, like most other parts of India, handloom weaving here also was on severe decline around the 2000s. Because of mass-produced cloth, but also there was a big earthquake and other natural disasters there. In 2004-5 onwards, some of the older weavers and an organization called Khamir got together to do a very interesting innovation around the local organic Kala cotton, and actually created a market out of that, which has become so flourishing that in these last about 15 years or so, many of them have come back into weaving. Many of the young men who had gone off to work in factories in Adani and Tata, or even gone off to the Gulf countries, are starting to come back into weaving. And girls who were never actually sitting on the loom traditionally are also now sitting on the loom and expressing their creativity and making lots of wonderful clothes and cloth out of this. And what I find really interesting is the kind of narrative that they're coming up with here. It's not just the economic livelihood which is now attracting them, but also the fact that they are in control of their own time. It's not some boss who is telling them what to do. They can express their creativity. It's an enjoyable task. It's not a mechanical task. Like what Prakash said over there on the slide, you see, the loom is my computer. I actually enjoy it. I'm using my mind and my hands at the same time, and my heart, because if my love doesn't go into the cloth, you'll get something which you don't really like. So there's some very interesting transformations taking place there. Also in Kutch, this village, Kunaria, has during the COVID period done some really interesting work on community health. They were amongst the first to start imposing their own safety mechanisms, but at the same time ensure that the workers who were doing NREGS work, rural employment guarantee work, continued to be able to work, unlike in the rest of India where the government imposed a lockdown that created such incredible unemployment. So here that was continued. They built their own health system, their disaster management system. A lot of the women had already got kind of empowered to take care of these sorts of issues. And local poorer families who were not able to cope during the lockdown period were helped by other families in the same village. And recently we spoke to them, and they're actually considering, out of the COVID experience, how do we create a localized economic system in which at least all those things that we use at home, soaps and detergents and footwear and things like that, can be produced within our own rural economy rather than have to buy it outside. They spend 40 lakh rupees a month buying those sorts of things. And they're saying that's a waste. Why should we not just produce it? And here you find examples such as the third Kudumbashree in Kerala, where in fact black women are doing exactly that. They're producing things for household use in their own villages, wherever they are, and getting some kind of dignified livelihoods out of that. And it's because of the Kudumbashree network of women's groups across Kerala that that's one state where COVID was handled much better than other parts of India. Moving to central India, this is an example of 90 villages forming a federation or a Mahagram Sabha, initially to get together to fight against the mining proposals by the government, but also to assert their identity as Adivasis, their cultural identity, their own history as Adivasis, some of what Regina was talking about, for instance, and claim forest rights across the whole area. They have actually managed to get community forest rights in that entire area, and to start making plans on how this forest can be both conserved and used for sustaining livelihoods. In the COVID period, because of the fact that they had earned and put into the Gram Sabha funds substantial amount of money from the forest use, they were able to cope much better again when migrant workers from their villages came back. They were able to help them with relief measures and to cope with the 2, 3, 4 months of lockdown. This experience itself arises from an older one, Mendhalekha, which some of you may be familiar with, a village which 30 years back declared that even as we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our village, we are the government. And I'll come back to that notion of democracy when I talk about the framework. Many other examples of sort of rural revitalization, of reverse migration, etc. Some of these have their own problems. For instance, Ralegan Siddhi Baba, Anna Hazare's village, there's issues of casteism and so on. But you can see there are sort of glimpses of what could be in terms of, for instance, economic self-reliance and localization, even as there are need to be struggles for social justice. Quickly, some things about cities, because I don't want to talk only about villages. Going back to Kutch, Bhuj has a very interesting initiative by 5 civil society organizations working with the administration, sometimes against the administration, to create much more self-reliance for the poorer parts of the city, the so-called slums, including their own reconstruction. So you can see the top right-hand side picture there is actually a reconstructed slum, where local people have been involved in doing the reconstruction. Women's empowerment to make sure that they are very centrally a part of the decision making in the area sabhas and the ward sabhas. Much more decentralized governance, trying to take the 74th constitutional amendment forward in as much as they can. And also trying to address issues of the informal sector here, the sex workers, the pastoralists, the domestic workers, etc., to be able to unionize themselves or mobilize and organize themselves so that they get a much better deal in the city. Sometimes it's a bit uncommon, but sometimes the privileged middle classes also act. So many examples now in places like Pune and Bangalore and elsewhere, where things like much more responsible use of water, much more responsible ways to treat waste, or maybe even reduce waste in the first place, for instance, through these zero waste detail shops. The revival of natural ecosystems in cities like that lake Kaikondrahalli in Bangalore, which you see in the slide. The attempt at participatory budgeting to say that the city budget should not be made only by bureaucrats and politicians, but in fact should emanate from local mobilization of what we think in our own locales is the budget should be like, what are our own priorities, and then from that kind of make the city budget. So many such examples now of urban action also taking place. We've put a lot of these examples into a series of documents that we are producing. 2 are already out with about 25 cases, called The Extraordinary Work of Ordinary People. How communities have created or built resilience during the COVID period. I will put up the links in the chat when I finish, but you can take a look at this. These are now available in 6 or 7 languages apart from English. I also want to talk very quickly about an issue I think that I heard Regina, I think, spoke about, which is about education. We know that the education system, especially as it was put in by the British period, very cleverly, because if you can colonize people's minds, you really need an army to continue colonizing them. The education system, which continues to be very colonial in many different ways, it's basically meant to make sure that each one of us becomes like a proper robot that can fit into a system. But we do have a number of now very interesting alternative learning spaces, such as the ones listed on this slide, where the attempt is to try and create spaces of fun while you're learning. And here it's very important to look at the original meaning of the word school, which was from the Greek word schole, which meant leisure. Now imagine Indian schools and leisure. I mean, it's as far away as possible. But here are examples where they've tried to create that, to reconnect with the community, to reconnect with your own ecological system, while also learning about other cultures and being open to what's happening outside, thinking of issues and looking at issues of ecological sustainability, social justice, etc., in ways that are really creative and also enhancing every child's creativity in many different ways. We have stories and case studies of each of these on our website, so you can take a look. The same thing with technology. Because of the kind of forces we've had, we've come to think that technology is created only in the formal government institutions or the private corporations. Whereas in fact, through most of history, technological innovations has taken place by ordinary people, right? And there are now movements to try and again democratize technology and knowledge and science, so that we can all be participants in this, but also have some sort of control, democratic control over this. Again, some examples of this, the bottom left-hand side is the Sekmol Alternative Learning Center in Ladakh, where the construction has been made in such a way by the faculty and the students themselves with passive solar, that when it's minus 20 degrees outside, inside the building, you don't need any artificial heating. Now imagine the amount of power saved if you can do things like that. The exact opposite is the top right-hand side, Hunarshala office in Kutch, 40 degrees plus in the summer, and inside you need no air conditioning, sometimes not even a fan, because they've used a lot of traditional and some modern architectural principles to create that. The last set of examples is on media and communications and arts, because we know that these sectors have also come under greater and greater corporate control or have remained under some kind of government control. So the creation of alternative learnings, alternative media spaces and communication spaces, and to bring art and culture back into the public domain rather than this sort of rarefied classical domain, which is controlled by just a few people or a few corporations now. And again, here are some examples of the kind of attempts at trying to make sure that people have their voice being heard by others, even if the mainstream media is ignoring them. So when all of this happens through people's own initiatives, when both practice and public advocacy also kind of gets put together, we do see occasionally that governments, which can otherwise be extremely regressive, sometimes will bring in progressive policies and laws and programs, such as the ones that you see here. The Right to Information Act, for instance, which probably is it's a relatively revolutionary act given the kind of governance we normally have. The Forest Rights Act, which has enabled at least a few communities to claim back their collective forest rights, and organic farming programs and policies in many states, renewable energy programs. All of these have their own issues and problems. For instance, renewable energy in many parts of it being promoted in a very large scale mega solar project kind of thing, which is not really democratic and people friendly or ecologically friendly. But there are also programs for supporting decentralized renewable energy, decentralized organic farming. So you can see spaces can be created within the government also. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples from outside India, just to give a flavor of the kinds of things that are happening there. This is again very, very inspiring. This is the Kurdish ethnic region in the middle of what is the most war-torn area of the world, the Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq border area, where the Kurdish ethnic community that's been traditionally marginalized by all these countries, the dominant sections of these countries, have tried to create a zone of eco-feminist peace, and direct radical democracy, local commune being in control of its own affairs, and then federating over larger landscapes. And they use an ideology which they call genealogy, which is spelled Jinea, which jin means women. So it's really intensely based on a much more a spirit of caring and sharing rather than competitiveness, a spirit of working with the earth and with each other. Of course, they also have their own army because that's the only way they can survive. So there's a very interesting dynamic over there of how they've tried to create a very alternative system. Then these are examples from Europe, where young people, highly educated, have opted out of the mainstream system and tried to do something different. So for instance, the bottom left-hand side is alternative currencies, where they say that at least for some things in our life, we don't need to be ruled by the euro. Can we create our own localized economic exchange using our own currency? In this case, it's called Becky, which 5 communities are using in Luxembourg. Or what's called time banking, which is to say that instead of money, can we actually share our time, which is what traditionally has happened in many different ways, right? But here there's a school that is run very cheaply, but with very high quality, because parents are taking part in helping with administration and teaching free of cost. And that's part of a larger time banking in the community where people say, okay, I will offer 5 hours of free service. I'm a good, I don't know, physics professor, or I'm a good yoga teacher or whatever. And for the community, I'm offering 5 hours of free service every week. In return, I'll get something from somebody else. And even if I don't, it's part of the spirit of being part of a community. The top left-hand side is a non-profit cafe that is run by young people in Athens, where their philosophy is that, of course, if we invest, we need to get back our investment, but we're not into making profits and becoming like this capitalist owner. And they deliberately employ refugees and so-called disabled people in order to provide it. So it's part of what's called a social or solidarity economy, many examples of which across Europe you can find. Interesting examples also of local governance in what's called municipalism, or feminist municipalism, such as Barcelona. Just last week, for instance, Barcelona decided, has taken a decision on how to demotorize its streets. I mean, remove or reduce significantly the private car and increase significantly the spaces for pedestrianization, bicycling, and public transport. And there are other sorts of kind of decisions of this kind, where you have a local governance that's responsive to the grassroots. And again, it's like about feminizing politics. Okay, let me move in the last 10 minutes to looking at the sort of overall frameworks of transformation that are emerging from these and hundreds of other examples around the world. We see change or transformation taking place in 5 spheres of life. So this Olympics-like diagram that you see is about politics, economics, society or social relationships, culture and knowledge, and ecology and environment. I don't have the time to go into each of these in great detail. I'm happy to send you documentation later on this, but I'm going to just talk about maybe 2 or 3 of these spheres very quickly to see what are the kinds of transformations taking place, and then end with talking about a set of fundamental ethics and values that emerge from these examples. So let's take the first 2 spheres, that's economics and politics. Now, if you think of some of the examples I gave you, they're about saying that we don't agree that democracy is about the state, that is the government, or corporations being in control. We believe that we are the ones where decision making should lie, first and foremost. And then we build upwards based on, or outwards based on that. So it's about Medha Lekha saying, in our village, we are the government, even as we elect a government in New Delhi or in Mumbai. It's about forest dwellers in central India, or the Dalit women farmers in Telangana saying, when it comes to our economic production, the means of production have to be in our control, not in the control of the government or of some capitalist. So how does one bring power back to the people? Really take the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments to their logical extent, which of course no government wants us to do. And then, because we will still need institutions at the larger scale, how do those institutions become much more accountable to the units of democracy on the ground? Through, for instance, rotational representation, through the right to recall, through public audits, some of which have been attempted in India, some in other parts of the world. This has to also then be accompanied by the reverse of economic globalization, to say that at least for basic needs, we have to localize. We have to be able to be secure for our basic needs in our own local environment. That doesn't mean every village by itself, but in some form of local, sort of localized geography. We have to do that, even of course, as we struggle for issues of social justice, because localization can also be enormously unequal. How do we rebuild the economics of caring and sharing? Economics not as intense hostile competition, but as an act of solidarity, right? Which is what it is, and an act of creating well-being for everybody, where well-being is not about percentage of GDP growth, but it's about, does everybody have adequate nutritious food? Does everybody have clean air and water? Does everybody have a satisfactory creative livelihood, etc.? Now, one of the most interesting outcomes of this form of thinking is the questioning of the current political boundaries. So let me give you an example of what could be. So start thinking about a borderless South Asia. Now, if you think of it, many parts of the world, the nation state boundaries are accidents of history. They could be an outcome of colonial history, for instance, in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or some other form of sort of historical thing. And what that has done in many parts of the world is it's created barriers between ecosystems that are otherwise contiguous, like the Sundarbans mangroves between India and Bangladesh, or the desert, the cold desert and the between India and China, or the sand desert between India and Pakistan, etc. And one that created barriers and boundaries for barriers and fences for wildlife to move back and forth. So it's enormous impact on biodiversity, but also on local communities who were moving back and forth, nomadic communities, traders, etc. So can we reimagine a South Asia where political decision making takes place on the basis of biocultural areas of relationships, of ecologically contiguous areas like mountain ranges or mangrove systems or the oceans, etc. It's worth thinking of. It is a movement that has happened in other parts of the world, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But if we really want to think of ecology and culture at the basis of life, then we have to think also of questioning the current political boundaries. I think these are issues that have already been spoken about by earlier speakers better than I can. But again, all of this needs to then also be fundamentally based on sustaining, reviving the diversity of cultures, the mutual respect for different faiths and belief systems and so on, which is unfortunately being greatly threatened in India today by the imposition of one religion. The democratization of knowledge, which I already spoke about, of the media, of communications, and the ability for each one of us to also know ourselves individually better, even as we work with and try and create collective goodwill. And none of this is going to work unless we also rebuild our relationship with nature. And to me, the bottom left-hand image says it in one beautiful image. We think of human beings currently as being the dominant species on top of the so-called evolutionary pyramid. But as Adivasis, indigenous peoples have always said, we are one out of lots and lots of species. We are part of nature. We're not separate from it. How do we bring that back into our moments is, I think, one of the most important aspects of transformation. So let me end by just talking about quickly one of the sort of ways in which we're trying to depict this in India is what we call eco-Swaraj or Prakritik Swaraj, which is to say, as I said, each one of us is a decision maker or should be a decision maker. We have to assume power that is inherent in us. But as we do that, we are also responsible to others' autonomy, freedom, and their power. And others means not just other human beings, but also other species. So we become ecologically radical democracy is what we're talking about. There are similar notions in many, many other parts of the world, including many others from India itself. The book Pluriverse, which you see on the image there, has 90 or 100 examples of these from around the world. Some of the most incredible things, for instance, many of us think of Ubuntu as being a software program. Actually, it's the Southern African philosophy that I am because we are. That is to say, as an individual, I'm important, but without the collective, I'm nothing. You know? So it brings up a sense of responsibility. And some of these very radical movements and concepts are even emerging from the industrial society itself. Ecofeminism, degrowth, many others, the commons. So there's a lot of very interesting churning that's taking place around the world. Now, the last slide is the one which I think is the most important and needs, of course, a lot of discussion, which is people often ask me, how do you replicate, say, a Deccan Development Society somewhere else, or a Korchi Mahagram Sabha somewhere else, or a Kurdish Rojava movement somewhere else? And my response has always been, it's not about replication, nor is it about upscaling. It's really about outscaling, which means learn the values and the principles that people have employed in making that transformation happen, and then apply it in our own context with modifications as necessary. So this is a set of values that we have learned from these movements. And of course, I'm sure you can add many on your own. We could have a whole separate session on this, but basically, if you take, for instance, the fourth bullet point there, it's really about cooperation in the commons rather than competition and the privatization. Or if you take almost this fourth last bullet point, it's not just about human rights, but also the rights of other species. So you can start thinking of transformation from the point of view of these basic ethical principles. So really, worldviews that celebrate not money, not fame, not being politically dominant, but that celebrate life itself. And it's a combination of all of these things, which to my mind is what we need, not the so-called Green New Deal, which is being talked about in many parts of the world now, but really green, blue, red, pink, many different revolutions of different kinds, which bring different forms of justice together, which is what we need emerging out of this. And so it's this combination of local to global resistance plus construction, sort of greater and greater networking amongst ourselves, practice plus visioning and dreaming. It's these combinations that could hopefully create the kind of macro transformations, the sort of critical mass that we need for effecting the macro change. And one of the platforms we use for doing this is what's called Vikalp Sangam. Some of you are already part of this. Some of you, groups like NCDHR, are members of the core group of the Vikalp Sangam. Living Farm. So basically saying how people are doing these kind of amazing things practically and conceptually, can get together to learn from each other, to even constructively criticize each other, to build more collaboration, to build collective visioning, and to put out the stories of transformation and hope that are there all around us, but they don't get the kind of media space that we want them. So that's the website, which has 1,500 stories. Please do take a look, especially if you're feeling depressed. Now Vikalp Sangam is on, I think, all the other media sites also. And these are some of the books that would be maybe of interest. And the one on the top left-hand side is where 40 people have sort of imagined India in 2100 and then come back down to earth and said, okay, how do we get there? So there are articles on Dalit futures, on Adivasi futures, on conservation futures, on education, on health, on many different topics. The top right-hand book is 9 very detailed case studies of transformation in different parts of the world, including some examples I've given you. And the one at the middle, I've already told you, is the more global book of examples. And using the Vikalp Sangam experience, we've linked up with similar things happening in other parts of the world to create a sort of a global platform for trying to put together the sort of critical mass of collaboration and sharing and visioning and advocacy for the larger changes needed across the world. And we're linking up with other many global such processes. So I hope that's not been too long or too fast. It's a very large ground to cover in this period of time, but I hope I've been able to give some sense of the kind of both the challenges, but also the amazing things that are happening on the ground. That's my email ID if somebody wants to get in touch, and some of the websites where there's much more information. So Puneet, I'm going to
Yeah,
stop there, and then I'd be happy to
yeah,
engage in a conversation.
yeah. Thank you, Ashish ji. I request all the participants to please put their questions in the chat box or raise your hand. We would love to hear you voice your own questions. Also, we will be uploading the whole conference on YouTube and sharing presentations and contact details because many of you have been asking for it of the speakers who will consent to it via email in a few days. Yeah, so we look forward to your questions. There is a question in the chat box from Malvika.
Give me a second, I'm
She,
switching over.
yes, sure, sir.
Yes, go on.
Yeah. So there's a question from Malvika already. She is asking what will be the paths of bioregional governance. I am trying to imagine how this would work. How are current examples working out?
Yeah, thanks, Malvika. Should we do one by one, or we want to take a set of
Yeah, I think it'll be
questions?
good if we can go one by one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Malvika, this is so. If you take South Asia as an example, one of the things that's possible, of course, it will be very challenging, but that could be possible, is that if we imagine radical democracy, like "Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar," we are the government in our village kind of thing, then you can kind of imagine that, let's say, the fishing communities in Sundarbans, we have thousands of people living in the Sundarbans, both in Bangladesh and in India, who are connected and related to each other, that they could be empowered to actually govern that region, and to govern the region in a way that is ecologically sustainable, culturally, lively, and so on, but also a peace zone. Okay, um, that might be slightly easier, but you can actually imagine doing that even, let's say, in the Siachen area between India and Pakistan, or the Ladakh and Tibet area, where the nomadic communities, in the Changthang area, on this side of the border, and then similar communities on the other side, in some way kind of rebuild their relationship and are able to govern that area as a area of peace, tear down the fences or whatever it is, including the ones recently that China seems to have erected, and create that as an area of ecological peace and livelihood security. So you can start thinking of these kinds of things and actually building towards them, advocating them, envisioning them, advocating them, building the people to people dialogues which might make them possible, even though it's, of course, a very, very difficult challenge. Now, there are examples in other parts of the world where something like this has happened, more like a transboundary kind of cooperation and relationship, where for conservation purposes or livelihoods purposes, people have, two or three or four countries have together have agreed that they will work rather than in a conflicting way, kind of work towards reconciling this. This happened as part of the reconstruction of Europe, for instance. It's happened in a couple of parts of Africa. Um, and within countries, it's happening also in some areas. So we can imagine that, for instance, the whole of the Western Ghats could be imagined as a political constituency, because ecologically it is sort of one contiguous zone, which is currently cut into 6 states. But you can think of it like that, where again the Adivasi and the non-Adivasi communities in that area are kind of empowered to govern it for ecological sustainability and for livelihood security. There's a similar attempt that's happening right now with what's called the Great Ridges initiative in the almost the entire eastern part of Australia, a huge, some I think 4,000, 5,000 kilometer area that's longitudinally that's being considered like that. There are attempts in Latin America like that for the whole of the Andes. So many ways in which one can actually think of doing this, at least conceptually. How to work it practically is part of the challenge we have to confront.
All right. So since we are very lucky that Regina, Paul, and Dr. Debal are still here with us, if any of the participants have any questions for them also, they can ask. And if any of the speakers have any questions for Ashish ji, please go ahead and ask them. And till those, yeah, is there somebody? Okay. So, but before that, till more questions come, Ashish ji, I had a question. Uh, and this can later be addressed even by Regina or Paul or Debalda or Samhita if they want. Ki since the whole day today, several of the speakers were talking about communities. Uh, you know that it's one of the alternatives. But my question is, what is the nature of these communities that we are imagining, especially in the context of how Paul brought out, ki it were these heterogeneous traditional communities where caste-based power structures came up, where gender-based patriarchal structures came up, where several other sort of social exclusions have happened. And all these examples that have been that Debalda and Ashish ji, you also cited, are those homogeneous communities, are these heterogeneous communities? What are the power structures within these communities and within these alternatives? If there are any sort of social exclusions happening within them. So this is sort of the framework that I was wondering about. Ki what are these communities that we are talking about as alternatives?
Thanks, Puneet. I think if you look at the examples I gave you, that's why I deliberately started with the example of Dalit women farmers. You cannot think of a more marginalized section of people in India than them. Yeah, and they are in villages where there are upper castes, there are bigger landlords, etc. Or I gave the example of the Vankars in Kutch, also once marginalized, once impacted by untouchability, etc. Even the Adivasi communities, interestingly enough, or incidentally, are not necessarily firstly only Adivasi. There are also non-Adivasis, but even within Adivasis, there are issues of, for instance, gender inequality. Now, in all of these examples I've given you, and let me start by saying that these are still exceptional examples. It's not like this is happening commonly all over the country, right? If it was, we wouldn't need to have this webinar. Uh, but the fact that they're happening in the most adverse of situations suggests that there's a great possibility for that kind of transformation to take place, where you begin to reimagine the community, where there is a collective spirit that is either sustained or a new collective spirit that is brought in, but not accepting the traditional inequalities that are entrenched in many of them, challenging them. So that's what the Dalit women farmers of DDS did in Telangana. Or if you take the Korchi Mahagram Sabha, as a very deliberate act as part of that, because they know that women have not been traditionally part of decision-making structures in that part of Adivasi India, that there is a whole separate process of women's empowerment by themselves and with help, so that they actually get the confidence and the capacities to be able to voice their issues and concerns and ideas within the Mahagram Sabha, the individual Gram Sabhas and the Mahagram Sabha process. So the same thing is happening, for instance, in Kutch, where you also have the traditional hierarchy of age, where it's always the elder man who is supposed to be listened to, and that's being challenged. So for instance, in the Vanakar community, the youth who have come into or are continuing with the weaving are saying, we also want to express our own creativity. We will learn from the elders because we respect them. There is knowledge, there's wisdom there. We will learn from that, but we will also express ourselves. And that's created a sort of a different dynamic of relationship between the generations. So you see, that's the kind of thing. Now, ideally, the state, the government, should be supporting this kind of transformation. What we see is the reverse, that in fact the state mostly, with exceptions, mostly further entrenches these inequalities, adding, for instance, a class inequality on top or a governance inequality on top, so that the local village secretary, for instance, will be siding with the upper caste sarpanch, right? Or the district collector will listen more to the upper caste or the upper classes than to the Dalits and so on. So the state tends to actually, so if one thinks that, okay, community by itself cannot do it, And I agree that community often by itself cannot do these kind of transformations. It needs either a local really dynamic leadership and or some civil society help and or some government, enlightened government help. But left to the government by itself, I don't think any of these changes are going to take place. Just having reservations, for instance, has not transformed the lives of the vast majority of Dalits, as far as I know. Paul, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So this is what we're saying, that community reimagined, but not thrown away. The baby being thrown away with the bathwater is not the solution. But the community has to be reimagined, absolutely. It cannot remain in the kind of, with the horrendous inequalities that have been there, characterized it in many parts of India, or many parts of the world in the past. Debal might have more to add here.
Yeah.
Debal, hi. I didn't know you were there. I didn't see you there.
Yeah, thank you, Ashish. You have already covered all the points that I wanted to tell. I have nothing to add, except in saying that no, just one qualitative point. I mean, you have already mentioned it. You know, the reimagining the community in order to get rid of these, the inherent inequalities that were traditionally handed down over generations before. But there are communities, as you have already given an instance, where the communities themselves refurbish the community composition, like the youth taking over this decision making power over the older people. But the example that I was fond of giving is that it's not there is a hierarchy, of course, like there's the leadership, but this leadership is not uh, a kind of absolutist leadership that everyone has to follow exactly what this the leadership had already dictated. It's not a dictatorship. As I mentioned, it's not a majority minority count either. Rather, it's a consensus. Uh, I just give one example from the Menominee and also the Ho community. Any single decision was floated by the leader. The leaders, usually the older one, because he has this vision and experience and the knowledge that from his predecessors and the age advantage, from knowledge point of view, he gives kind of proposition, and this is floated within the community, and all the members of the community, each one of them, men and women, have to discuss, and everyone has the right to hear, listen, but everybody also must participate. There is no kind of representative. No, okay, I agree what you might have said. I agree what you might have agreed to, and I have no dispute. No, it's not allowed. You have to be present and you have to voice yes or no personally. This was the rule, and I have this amazing fortune to witness one exceptional situation where one or two individuals dissented. Majority of this, the whole community, let's say of 250 individuals in the whole community I'm talking, two individuals disagreed. And because there was no majority kind of thing, in our democracy, we always see majority is the right. It's not. These two individuals stuck to their point logically. They gave their reasons. And this was discussed for a long, long time, at least 5 hours. On the second day, the discussion continued until these two individuals were convinced by the counter evidence and counter logic, and they agreed, yes, they made a mistake, and now they agree, they see the point, with the effect that the points that they made was also incorporated into the final decision, because they said, the majority said, yes, we did not look into that kind of possibility. So they modified the final decision. So it was a consensus by both parties, both adapting to this, the pros and cons of the same proposition. So this is the kind of innovative approach, and this is the real democracy, participatory, vibrant democracy, which is missing. So as long as there is a participatory, vibrant democracy where every individual member of the community has the right to say and hear everything, right to decision making until everyone agrees, I don't think the age is a factor in that case. whether this first proposed by a 60-year-old man or a 25-year-old young man. So that way, yeah, these the constituency and the consistency of the decision-making power and the decision-making mechanisms of the communities can evolve. And so far in the 25 communities that I have worked with, majority of them have absolutely no problem, because in some cases there are also women who are the leaders, even in the patriarchal society. The Garos, for example, a Garo woman, a leader, and she was this leader, but that doesn't mean that she had this, what you say, what most feminists would be happy to say, matriarchy. There's no archy. It was a leadership, but it was equally divided. I mean, the responsibility of decision-making power was equally divided among every member of the community. And until this was consensus, it was not passed. It was not resolved. This is the strength of democracy, which our parliamentary democracy, whether it's in the US or in India, are far lacking in. And I think, to build a new community, whether it's, building a seed silo, a community seed bank, for example, or a community water resource harvesting system, or decision-making power, taking a decision whether we should employ a kind of, machine in this case or not. I mean, a machine which is locally available, not depending on a giant company and so on and so forth. It all needs this kind of decision making power by all the individuals within the community, and that needs this kind of democratic apparatus, not voting, not by majority, but consensus. I think this is the greatest learning that I have learned, I have taken from these communities, indigenous communities. Very unfortunately, this is an aside, both the rightist parties and the leftist parties, including the extreme left, I'm saying, they have disintegrated this democratic power, democratic institution in the indigenous societies. Fortunately, one of these ex-Naxal leader, I'm not mentioning his name, he has published 2 of his articles recently. And he admitted that in Santals in West Bengal, among the Santal communities, there was exactly this democratic apparatus, consensus. And he admits that it was the action of these political parties who took over this decision-making power. They disintegrated, dismantled this democratic institution of these indigenous societies in the first place. This is exactly what's happening in all the other societies, whether they are the so-called Gandhian parties or Marxist parties. The whole thing is, taking over the power of the decision-making from the indigenous societies and the indigenous councils and villages in the name of, vanguard wisdom kind of thing. This is very unfortunate. So well, that's history, that's an experience, of course. We have to learn from this, and we have to go forward by learning this from this wisdom of these indigenous societies where they are still following this. And we can consolidate this one, and we can learn and replicate this kind of models in the new communities that we are going to build. I think that's enough.
Yeah, thank
Can
you.
I ask a question?
Yes, just a second, Santosh. I think Dr. Regina wanted to say something.
Oh, I forgot. But anyways, I think this is a question to Ashish and maybe anybody as participants or speakers could answer my point. One of your slides, talks about the pejorative terms around, say, civilized, uncivilized, primitive, jungly, all those stuff, inferior, superior, and and everything. And the thing that you said, that even if you go to Adivasi village, you'll find Adivasi saying that hame development chahiye. The thing is, where has this notion of where has this notion of, and of course you do mention that these have been colonial constructions, but for Adivasis, we feel there is an internal colonization itself. And who are kind of creating those narratives. is the upper castes, and the communities which are moving towards in the Schedule 5 areas, which are rich in, resources and industries are being set. So on whom does the onus lies in dismantling the pejorative, the negativeness of these terms? I mean, for instance, when Paul was speaking, on and off, I realized that, you do feel angry. You do feel angry. Should the onus of education, should the onus of taking out this pejorative sense, this negative sense, be on us itself? So on whom does it lie? And for instance, and definitely it has to be communities who have remained privileged. Many of you must have traveled to, the US, the Canada, and you do recognize people acknowledging that you are standing on this land. I think you're standing on the lands of so-and-so nations and XYZ. But I think in the Indian context, that is not expected. But at least what is expected, those who are getting in those places of articulations and making, how can they acknowledge their privilege? I think in India and places like India and South Asia is the middle class, is the upper caste who would be doing the environmentalism. How can they dismantle, and help in contributing? So if we are imagining a society which is equal, and there is this the way of existing in a way, it's in a way that there is some sense of, because the whole question comes around power. You talked around, some patriarchy, statism, everything. It's all around power. So how please, anybody from, speakers and participants respond, because I would put the onus on some of you to think about it and how, in your own actions and, recognitions, do you do that?
So just an intervention. Even though we are approaching 6 o'clock, I guess we can carry on because these are very important conversations and discussions to have. And we also have a couple of questions lined up. So to those participants and speakers who are comfortable, we would be very happy if you could carry on with us for some more time. Yeah, Ashish, if you would like to respond, or if any participants would like to respond to Regina's question.
Yeah, I'll attempt a quick one. I mean, obviously, as I'm sure Regina would also agree, this is a very complex subject. We need a longer discussion on it. But I think, Regina, I mean, first of all, that question is absolutely valid. And it's absolutely valid for those who have been marginalized and exploited to ask this question and to sort of throw it back on those of us who are in more, privileged situations. I think the onus definitely lies on those who have dominated. And those of us who are in privileged situations asking these questions have the responsibility of asking these questions as forcefully and as clearly as possible, and raising these issues as forcefully and clearly as possible. Which is why, for instance, in my presentations, I try and always raise questions about these terms, even, for instance, primitive, but the original meaning of which actually was the original people or the original knowledge. There's nothing pejorative about it, but the way it's used is very pejorative, and we have to question that ourselves. So I think the onus lies on us. But unfortunately, Regina, I think we have to, and you understand this better than me, is that onus, that by itself will not suffice, because those who are currently in power are not necessarily going to want to give over that power. There might be some exceptional people within the powerful classes that are doing what they are doing, trying to do what they can, but these are exceptional. So, which means that movements from within the Adivasis and the Dalits are as important, which is what you people are doing, right? To actually even bring this to the consciousness of people like us. Because very often it's not in the, I mean, I know when I was doing my school, I learned none of this. I learned this because I started getting involved with, I got involved with the Narmada Bachao Andolan and then with a number of Adivasi movements and so on. And that's where I learned these things from, where it kind of hit me in the face saying, even some of my thoughts, my words, my language was in some sense or the other colonial. And I agree with you that it's colonial, not just foreign colonial, but also internal colonial. Absolutely. Whether it's caste or class or whatever notions of internal colonization that we have. So I think it's this dual thing. I think it's this relationship between those of us who either are already or need to be made sensitive to these issues. And that also then means changing the education system of those where the privileged are learning. So that students, young people in these privileged sections of society in their schools and colleges are actually learning the Adivasi history of India or the Dalit history of India. They're learning, they're reading Dalit literature, Adivasi literature, etc., which unfortunately doesn't happen. But also your own movements, which are making sure that that kind of voice is coming to us. What we do, just very quickly, is I don't think we're fully sensitive because there's so much of the privilege built into our own lives. But what we try and do, for instance, I will never ever say that I represent an Adivasi or a Dalit, ever. I will support, and I will say, I think this is what I'm hearing from Adivasi and Dalit movements. Like I said about the Deccan Development Society, Dalit women farmers, because I've been involved with them for the last 25 years, but I would not represent them. I think, but what I could try and do using my privileges is to create the space for you to have your voice. Just to give you one example of that, I used to be involved with the global conservation movement. And the global conservation movement has been extremely top-down, extremely exclusionary, etc. You all know that. Now, what we did was to, instead of just saying that there is exclusion, there are human rights violations, there are indigenous people being moved out of protected areas, we said all that, but we said in these international circles, we will enable voices of those indigenous peoples to come themselves and speak. So in 2003, when the World Parks Congress happened, 150 indigenous, pastoral and local community people were enabled through our institutions to be there and to make their own voice. And that actually changed the dynamics of the meeting significantly, much more so than if I was to say, this is what's happening to Adivasi and these are the indigenous practices we should listen to. So I think that's our responsibility, to try and create those spaces, to support where those movements are taking place, and ourselves always be sensitive to the politics of language, the politics of representation. That's also very complex, because we realize in these international circles that sometimes it was the same one man who was coming from the indigenous people, one indigenous community of Latin America. And when we actually started getting contacts with other indigenous people of his own tribe, or his own indigenous people, and they were saying that we don't even know what the guy goes and says, and he doesn't come back and tell us. So there are, you know that, there are hierarchies even amongst the marginalized peoples. So all of this makes it very complex, but I think we just have to get more and more and more sensitive. As a man, for instance, I just have to be more and more and more sensitive to women's issues. I can never be a woman, and I don't think I can ever speak as a feminine person. But at least let me try and be sensitive to it and open to it, and to make sure that those spaces are there, and to back out if there is actually a woman who is speaking on feminism rather than me speaking about it. So I don't know, this is not enough, but I think these are the ways in which one would have to make sure that those solidarities are created so that your agency is expressed and we are supporting that. Even as we sometimes constructively challenge, like we constructively challenge that one guy who was representing the Kayapo in these international meetings. At some point when we learned that, we said, well, you know, this is what we heard from your own colleagues back home. So wo bhi kabhi karna padta hai sometimes, you know, but to do it in a way that's respectful, sensitive, not in a dominating kind of way.
I mean, even we, some of us women, Adivasi women, we are trying to think about Adivasi feminism and question patriarchy within. It's very challenging, you know, but we know that we have to have these conversations. We don't know how it will be really received, but we are trying to get authors, and the sad bit is some of them have done exceptional in the field, like in the field of sports or in the field of some other field, but they've never written. They have never written, how do you enable their journey? How do you enable those stories to represent? Because you are breaking gender boundaries by being in those space in short pants, So it's very interesting. And we are realizing even doing this task requires so much of patience, helping, say, talking over phone and taking what they want to say, and interviewing. So in a very collaborative process. So I mean, even just coming together and doing this exercise itself, we are realizing it's great, and we are learning. And let's see when it comes out, because it's such a slow process. But at least we are trying to do that. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Well, as a young person who's a student of environment, I think I'm very happy that we are having a conversation on justice part of climate justice, because from my limited experience, this sort of gets left out in many other conversations. Uh, we have 3 questions lined up, and I would request Santosh to please go ahead and ask her question.
Yeah, I have one observation and one question. Can I make an observation?
Yeah, please, Santosh, please.
Yes. So this is nice to observe discussion about climate justice, environmental justice for indigenous, Dalit and Bhujan people. My mind typically goes to the center of power. I mean, where is the power and where the decisions are made? And is our voice present there? So I think about, parliaments, assemblies, and courts. These are center of power, and how conflicts are happening, and things are getting resolved by these institutions. So I think about recently in 2020 April in fifth scheduled area regarding governance, a very important judgment was passed by the constitutional bench of the Supreme Court. I mean, many of you might be aware about that. But I find, lack of awareness typically in community which will get affected because of this judgment. Then recently in High Court in one of the states, they are again challenging the powers of the governor. Again, to what extent the state will defend the governor's power, it is up to the state to decide. But where is the voice of the people whose constitutional right or probably that scheme of governance will be probably made weak because if the judgment is passed adverse to them. So I think, we have to again think about taking our struggle nearer to the center of power where the significant decisions are made. So I'm just like trying to do my small bit in this struggle. One more important policy of affirmative action for scheduled tribes and scheduled caste. To what extent this is effective, whether it has really benefited the genuine tribes, that is an important question. So very less study has been done on this. My experience is people who administer these policies, they are themselves not fully aware about the complexity of affirmative action, hundreds of tribes, segregation amongst them, on what grounds, similarity of nomenclature, administrative broadly changes, some tribe remains in scheduled tribe, someone gets into scheduled caste. So it's a complex issue. So definitely we have to, identify these important power centers and try to take our voice, try to get our voice heard in this thing. So this was my small observation. Regarding a question, we are typically trying to create imagine a situation where a tribal society or indigenous society is an egalitarian society wherein community decisions are made in a very democratic manner. But I have observed because of, ma'am Dr. Regina talked about internal colonization, because of which the demography has changed. In reserved constituencies, issues close to scheduled tribes are no longer issues highlighted by public representatives anymore because the demography has changed. And so my question is, to what extent, because of this settlement of non-tribals in scheduled areas, particularly in tribal villages particularly, this decision-making, collective decision-making has deprived tribes of benefit. Uh, Again, with respect to intra-tribe differences, because tribe is not the homogeneous community, and with respect to tribe and non-tribe community structure at the village level. So anyone can respond to this.
Can I
Santosh,
respond to
please.
the?
Yeah.
Sorry, Regina. You want to
No,
go
no,
ahead?
no, no, Ashish, please. I was just
I
going
was, in
to.
fact, Regina, just going to say that the question maybe you would be better placed to respond to. I want to just do a quick response to the observation, first observation, if it's okay. Regina, is that okay? Can you?
Oh, you please go
Yeah.
on.
So, Santosh, in your first observation, I have two things to kind of, I know you haven't asked that as a question, but I think I would like to respond. One is, I think we have to also question ourselves, what is the center of power? Why do we continue to assume that parliaments and courts and so on are the only centers of power? Why is it that our community and our village cannot be the center of power? The 90 villages of the Kochi Mahagram Sabha are exactly saying this, that in our 90 villages, we are the center of power. And we will make sure that whatever government or whatever stuff happens here is accountable to our decision making. Now, that's the sort of indigenous self-determination movements that are happening all across the world, somewhat successfully in some parts of Latin America or Canada or Australia, somewhat not so successfully. I mean, it depends on a lot of circumstances. But I think we have to get away from this mental notion that New Delhi is the only center of power, or New Delhi or Bombay or whatever. The second thing is that, yes, they are currently holding a lot of power over us. So we have to do something to make them accountable. So for instance, one of the movements that I think we really need a national movement on this is the 73rd and 74th amendments, firstly, very badly implemented, but secondly, also not conceived properly. If you really talk about self-rule, then financial and legal powers also have to be at the level of the Gram Sabhas or the urban area Sabhas, which is not there. So when a law is made, say the farm laws right now, or the one that you spoke about, Santosh, ideally the constitution should say that no law can be made unless full consultation and approval has happened in the communities where that law is going to have an impact. But panchayats, gram sabhas and area sabhas do not have that legal power under the constitution. You don't have financial powers mostly under the constitution. So we have to push much harder. If it's policy changes we're talking about, we have to push much harder so that even by law and by constitution, the centers of power can shift much greater to wherever we are. And again, this is a movement in many, many different parts of the world. Self-determination must then mean all powers, not just administrative, not just over some bits and pieces of our land, but over everything that is to do with ourselves. So I just wanted to make that observation for your observation, Santosh. Regina, please go ahead.
Santosh, please, could you repeat the question? I have kind of lost that. Sorry.
You're saying that demographic changes have made, for instance, Schedule 5 areas are not only Adivasis or predominantly Adivasis. Many parts there are now mixed populations,
Yeah.
because of deliberate actions by government. So how do you deal with a situation like that?
I think there were additional questions around intra-tribe. What was it, Santosh?
Yes, so this is typically perceived that a tribal community is a homogeneous block at the village level. But I understand that there might be intra-tribe differences at the village level itself. Means it is a typical clan system, I understand that, but there might be some intra-tribe differences. So do you observe, because of this thing, I mean, they face some problem to manage their resources collectively or to resolve means common problems at the village level?
And of course, demographic change has affected in many ways. And sometimes, say, I can give you an example of, I'm a Santhal, and we have a Majhi Parganet system of self-governance. And predominantly, it's male representation from five, from five villages. And all the different kind of, small issues around land, around cattle, around fights, around XYZ, are very amicably, meeting is called, people are brought, and kind of each party is listened to, and it is resolved. What I am increasingly noticing, and I think it's around land, it's around inheritance of Adivasi women not having the right of inheriting the land. Even now, say, under the, what is this, where Hindu women could inherit land and property as equal to, a man. So it's not that aping, it's not about aping this thing, but the recognition that, like, I can give you my example. Like, my mom became a widow when I was 4 months, and we were like 5 of us, and it was really difficult. It's really difficult. How do you feed 5 mouths with someone who's barely literate? And you, what do? You go back to the village. You go back to the village for help. And the notion of daughters are liabilities, this is something which was not seen, but it came across that since you are all daughters, and so it is a huge liability. You can leave the children and whatever, you can remarry, because she's quite young when all this happened. So this whole thing about access to food or access to your paternal, there is food production, things are happening, but you're deprived that access. So these are those little, widowed women or single women or women whose husband has died or remarried, but for some reason they have been excluded. So increasingly there is an attempt to get these conversations in the the Parganet system, but somehow or the other, it's done in a way that it maintains the patriarchal control in the village. And this whole thing that, and also there's a big concern that what if a Adivasi woman marries a non-Adivasi? Okay, through you the land will transfer. And I think it's a very typical thing. And for Scheduled 5 areas, it's a big concern that can marriage become an easy this thing. But again, the women are questioning, how have men with all the control, how when you go to Ranchi, how when you go to wherever, how have you given all these lands then? If you think that you are the a caretaker of Scheduled 5 areas land and being custodians of this land, we don't see that you've done it very well. So these questions are being raised. So increasingly, women are going from the traditional systems of governance, the customary rights. You are trying to seek provisions. You're trying to seek remedy in the constitutional provision. So increasingly, women are going to small courts, lower courts, to figure out where there is a sense of, where you feel that that you've left with children and you have no means to, sustenance. So these are increasingly small numbers of cases that you are caught between, two systems of governance, and where you feel that your concerns are not being adequately addressed, and that there is an optional means, but it does create a tension. It does create a tension in terms of, but these are things which are happening. I'll give you just another example. The other day, we were discussing around, we came across a very interesting ornate piece of tribal jewelry. Okay. and I had taken a photo, which my mother had, and she had other jewelry, but I was I used to be very curious. Why does she take an extra care of this jewelry? Why not others? Keeping it separately in turmeric and blah blah blah, and so I asked other people, have you seen this jewelry? Why? I just want to understand why my mother took so much of care. Wish I had taken more conversations. Wish I had more conversations on this before she died. And many of the, the friends that I have, they haven't seen that jewelry. So I was just kind of tracing. I said, who do I talk? Who do I talk? And I kind of connected with someone in extended family. I said, I want to understand what is the name of this jewelry. And then, anyways, we found out it's a specific name. It's considered as one of the signature jewelry of Santhal. It is a earpiece. The way it is designed. And then I was wondering, what if we have to do a documentation of these designs, of these traditional designs? Where do these designs come? A beautiful, kya bolte, khopa mein lagane wala ye, or anklets and chains. Where are those designs? And I was so sad to realize, she said that shayad jahan bandhak rakhte hain, wahan milega. So this is what encroachment in tribal lands have done. Probably many of our cultural heritage around jewelry might have been lost simply because of some pretense on the other, around debt issues. We might have lost some of these.
Ashish,
have I answered some of your questions, Santosh?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, Santosh. Ashish and Regina, I hope, and Debalda, I hope you have time to take up more questions, or do you have prior commitments?
No, I'm fine. We can go on 10 to
I
15
have
minutes.
one point to add, if I have enough. I don't know if there's enough time, but about this very important and interesting question about this change in democracy, demography of these tribal societies. And it's also an interesting answer from Regina. I want to just add what Regina has just described is a fine example of the change in the relationship to land and property of the Santal community, which originally had no private property at all. Now we are discussing about the inheritance of this property, parental property. Of course, Santal community is a patriarchal society, and it was a paternal inheritance instead of the maternal inheritance or matrilineal, as it's in most of the Northeast communities, Northeastern states. But as Father Bowden recorded in 1850s, and K.K. Mitra had documented in 1920s, Santal communities owned the land communally. No individual, not a single family owned any piece of land or even a property excepting a set of bows and arrows and some other hunting implements and some clothes. No other property was owned by any single individual. This was so for most of the indigenous societies, and this I have dealt in detail in my book, why it is so easy for the non-tribal communities to say that because they don't have any title to land, it's ours. They cannot prove their ownership because they don't have any title to land. No, none of these original traditional tribal communities ever owned any piece of land. It was communally owned, and the reason they did not own any land, ownership means you have the right to sell it. You have the right to destroy it. And the moment you buy anything means, you have the price tag, and the price tag allows you to have the right to destroy it. I have this pen on my glass. I have bought this at 150 rupees because I own it, because I paid the price that was tagged on it. I have the right to destroy it. Nobody can have any legal question that I don't have the right to destroy it. My laptop or my phone or my shirt, anything, I can destroy it. Similarly with this land, the moment it is price tagged, like a patch of forest, The company would say, okay, what's the value of this forest? The price tag is say 1 million rupees. And one company would come forward and say, okay, I pay down this 1 million rupees and I own the right to this land and I can destroy it. This is exactly what's happening in the Amazonian rainforest. They're destroying this thousands of hectares of forest because they have paid for it to the government. The similar thing with Adani, they are paying for this one, whatever the price is, that's a different issue. But they can always say that I own it because I paid for it, I have bought it. This type of thing was never allowed because the indigenous communities always considered these natural things, whether it's a single tree or a whole forest land or a grassland or a wetland, they rent the, the annual rent accumulated over say 100 years, which is the R divided by the discount rate, is the economist's way of judging the price of it. Now, the discount rate or the interest rate in the indigenous societies everywhere, all over the world, is zero. Therefore, as a result of this, you divide anything by zero means infinity. So the price goes up to infinity. Nobody has a right, nobody has the ability to pay this infinite price for a single tree or a patch of forest. And therefore, you cannot own the land, you cannot buy the land, you cannot sell the land. This was the logic, the inherent logic of these indigenous communities everywhere, whether it's the American continents, Mesoamerica, Africa, Asia, Australia. And this is the reason why European settlers always argued that you don't have this title to land, so it's ours. And there was a battle. And they couldn't believe that it could be owned by someone else because it was communally held, it's everyone else. And I was actually told by one Jaroa individual, you say it's this, you have this banana tree, the Lodhas also, the so-called criminal tribe, they were labeled criminal by the British colonial administration because they always violated the so-called crimes, the definitions of crimes, property crimes. And Lodhas asked us, you have this banana tree and I have take this, one sheaf of banana and you say I'm stealing it. You mean it's your property? You own this tree? How can you own a tree? Can you command this tree to come to flowering or come to fruiting at your command? You can't. The tree will come to its flower when it's mature in its own biological state, the state of life. And how can you own it? And if you own it because you have fenced around it, you can also say the air that is passing through your property is yours, or the sunlight that is coming on your courtyard is yours. You cannot own the sunlight. You cannot own the air. How can you own this grass and the leaf and the birds and the trees on which these birds sit? This is so completely uncommonsensical to these societies. They cannot imagine this ownership of any property. Now we are discussing, like Regina is doing, is now considering how we can inherit this property from the parent. Why not the men? Why not the women? And so on and so forth. This is exactly the whole paradigm of the view. Property ownership was imposed much later, after 1920s, by the Santal Parganas Act and all of these kind of things. This is exactly what happened. The conditionality of and the vision of nature and ownership has all changed. So when we talk of indigenous societies, when I was talking, it was only that set of the communities which were still continuing in that mode of operation, not just by the ethnic identity. I was actually talking of the economic, ecological identity that I was talking about, not the ethnic identity by name. I give a very prominent example of the Rajvanshis of North Bengal. Rajvanshis in 1920s and 30s, they all returned in the censuses. They said they are Hindus because they considered, of course, they anthropologists have proven they are a fragment of the North Bengal communities, like tribal communities like Mech and Koch. These are the major communities, the tribal communities. So they are a fragment of this Koch and Mech tribes. But the Rajvanshis said, as the name says, Rajvanshi, they had the myth that one prince from Rajasthan or Rajputana married one of these princess of the Koch princess, and the descendants became the Kshatriyas. So they are the Kshatriyas, Kshatriya Hindus. Now, very evidently, they had all these kind of tribal things, sacred groves and many of these, non-Hindu rituals, widow remarriage, everything, which was forbidden in the Hindu society then. But then they instituted many of these equivalents of Hindu societies, like a priest. There was no Brahmins, but they had adhikari. And they also had this unique sacred grove worship, where this is the only sacred grove in the world where only single species is worshipped, and that is bamboo. And the one particular species of bamboo is golden bamboo. I documented it, I published this, and I published this with the help of this, the Rajvanshi societies. I have made a replica in the Bhopal Manav Sangrahalaya campus also, a replica of this Rajvanshi sacred grove. It's such a unique phenomenon. That all happened in 1992 onwards, 1996, 97, so on. When I visited this Rajvanshi society in 2005, it was a shock to me. Rajvanshi people are now claiming they are tribal societies. Now they are a part of this Kamtapuri movement. They are demanding a separate state for this Kamtapuri. Kamtapuri is the language. Kamtapuri language speaking tribals, all the North Bengal tribes, and Rajvanshi is the major tribe of this. They are demanding that they must be given the scheduled tribe status, which is already given in Assam, but not in Bengal, because they themselves claim their scheduled tribe, scheduled caste. Now, today they are demanding they should be recognized as a tribe. And when I told them that, what are the cultures that you are fighting for? They said, all our cultures and languages. When I mentioned, what about your sacred grove? They never heard about their own sacred grove. When I revisited those same villages, 20 villages I visited again, there was not a single sacred grove of Rajvanshi living there. There's not a single clump of the golden bamboo which they worshipped for centuries in the past. Now, should I call this today's Rajvanshi community as the same tribal society which had evolved, say, a century or 50 years ago? So that's the dynamism, I'm not blaming any of them. These are all political circumstances, identity crisis, language problems, all of these things, my point is that just the name of a tribe or an entity does not give this the tribal identity as we recognize it today with the indigenous worldview, which actually gave this the complete concrete relationship and the worldview in relationship with the property, the land, and the resources, whether it's in the form of these other cultural forms of sacred groves, bamboo clump, or sarnas in Jharkhand and others. These Santals, for example, taking your name, Hasda, the totemic name is Hasda, it's the duck.
Yeah.
Hembram has this Bodaloet is the banyan tree, which is the totem. Now we have, I know personally, hundreds of individuals, Hembrams and Hasdas, who simply have forgotten those names, the meanings, and the totems. Now, should we still consider them as representatives of the same tribe of Santals? So these are the, I'm just mentioning the complexity of this identity of the people. Just like one individual cannot represent the whole community.
Yeah.
For example, I cannot, be a representative of not only the tribals, even non-tribal communities too. I'm not a representative of Bengalis either, for example. An individual can never represent the whole community, but at the same time, the community itself, the name of a community does not represent the community's original identity as it was originally so. That's my point. So it's not only the democracy, the demography, it's also the cultural demography, internal complexity of the demography itself has also changed. It's a sea change. In the British colonial period, then this, the Indian colonial period, and this, the caste society influencing these tribal societies. And it's the kind of, in Hinduizations, Christianization, Sanskritization, all these waves of changes. And it's a buffeting movements all the time from outside. It's very difficult for any of these original tribal society to to continue its existence in the intact form, the original form. No community in the world has retained their entirely intact in its original form anywhere, whether it's in USA or India. So it's now we just have to fathom this, depth of this worldview. That's the point of my point.
Yeah.
And thank you,
Thank
Regina, for
No, I think
took advantage of.
Sorry, can I? Sorry.
No,
I have to
no,
leave. So if
no,
there are
Ashish, you
there are
go.
last two questions. No. I already
Oh,
said
there are
there are
questions.
one or two
Okay.
questions still waiting for a long
Yeah.
time. So if they want to finish and then.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, Devalda, to interrupt you. Amruta has been waiting. Amruta, can you please ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Puneet. Thank you, first of all, to give me this chance to express my deep sense of gratitude to all the panelists over here. Sirs and ma'am, it was such an enriching experience, to go through all the insights and have your viewpoints. It was tremendously helpful to me.
Amruta,
So,
please
if I
be
could
brief.
ask,
Yeah, please be
if I
brief.
could ask Debal sir, I could ask Debal sir as well as Ashish sir to kindly reflect upon the idea of having a participatory model of crop breeding across the marginal areas, for example, say rain-fed areas or so, and then see how this system, say participatory crop breeding system, works in a decentralized way, given the fact that there is a lot of resistance could be there from the other stakeholders, maybe the breeders community or even the extension service providers or even the government. That's we look for the policies and other legal measures. So, sir, how could you see this participatory crop model working, crop breeding model working across marginal areas with the involvement and the participation of the farming community in depth, starting from setting the breeding objectives, breeding goals, until the marketing?
One sentence from me, and then this is Debal's subject, so I'm going to hand it over to him. The only sentence I have is the example of the Dalit women farmers I gave you is actually absolutely of participatory breeding, but they've been doing it for probably centuries. It's not new. They have reasserted it in a new way now. And the other interesting part of that is that they are possibly the only, they will correct me if I'm wrong, possibly the only Krishi Vigyana Kendra which is run jointly by the government scientists and the Dalit women farmers, so that things like breeding or how agriculture should take place, etc., is so these Dalit women farmers are as involved in the even in the Krishi Vigyana Kendra decision making as the former state sector scientists. So I think there's a lot of this already happening, which we need to learn from. But Deval, this is your subject. Go ahead.
No, it's not my subject anyway. Anyway, I am not actually a breeder, but I have bred a few different varieties of rice. That's all. But my first reaction to this kind of government-led, government institution-led crop breeding program, which they call participatory, is that just like any other government program, like participatory forest management, is that I do, you participate. So all the decisions, what are the crops to be bred, what are the varieties to hybridize, and what are the goals to be set, whether it should be yield or to be the length of the crop or the length of the straw and so on and so forth. It's all decided centrally by the government institution, universally and without exception. Then they invite these, the other groups to verify whether this is acceptable to them or not. And if it is not acceptable, then they argue. I was a part of at least 7 such participatory programs led by these government institutions and universities. That, well, you say that no, this it's not really smellless. It has tasteless. But you see, the yield is much higher. Don't you agree? Yes, sir. We agree, and it's passed. So it's a kind of, simply like, the forest department saying that, look, we have 3,000 saplings of eucalyptus and 2,000 saplings of auriculaformis. Which one do you select? Now the villagers have no choice. Villagers have no choice of saying, we prefer mango and mahua. Oh, you're not given. So that kind of participatory program, I am really, case. by accepting this very exceptional cases just, mentioned by Ashish, this is really exceptional case. And for the participatory breeding, all the traditional crops and all the varieties of rice, wheat, dal, all the varieties of squashes, all the varieties of brinjal, okra were all developed by participatory process by all these farmer breeders. They themselves made these individuals. It was individuals who made this kind of selection and breeding experiments. Then it was shared by within the community. The community farmers actually either accepted or rejected, saying that no, this is not really suitable for our soil. This is not really tasty. This is not aromatic, or this is it's too weak in the stem, and there's a strong wind and it will lodge. So it's rejected. So in the process of selection, maybe 100 selected varieties were created, of which only 5 were selected and became fixed. And that was handed down over centuries. In my case too, the 5 varieties that I have created, I shared with these farmers, and 4 out of 5 were accepted by the community. I don't own this any ownership. I have not registered with the seed breeders and whatever. I give it for free to the community. But 4 of these 5 were accepted, 1 was not. So that's the process of participation. And many people also suggested that why don't you mix this kind of thing, that variety, so that the color gets here, so that this, the stature of this plant will be this high. These are the examples of participatory. Instead of central decision making, taking a decision of which varieties to breed for what purpose, and then taking assertion and kind of conditional assertion from the other participants. This is what I call this I do, you participate. So I think the example that you were, the question that you were asking about this, the participatory in the remote places, in these villages, if it is a community of thing, in this true sense of the community, not just by the physical proximity of individuals, if it's a community and they have this vibrant exchanging and sharing of the knowledge and seeds together within the community, then of course it's a participatory process already in being. So you can just introduce them, and if these individuals are capable of developing any variety, breeding any variety through selection or hybridization even, they can be filtered through this community approval and appreciation. That is the true participatory nature, and that is taking place in most of these tribal areas, remote tribal areas where out away from the modernization of agriculture influence. And I am very happy to be working with them. Many of these farmers, I'm just giving one example. One farmer actually saw a rare mutation, and then from that selection of this rare mutation, he has selected and bred to a new variety. From a white rice, he bred a red rice. The rice grain that is cooked is red. Encouraged by that and enthused by that, his own son, who was only 14-year-old, he developed his own keen eye, and within 3 years, he developed another breed from that one, his parents' own variety, which became a black rice. So white to red to black in just 2 generations of a farmer. And both of them are illiterate. They don't know anything about DNA. They don't know anything about enzymes or hormones or whatever. And they have achieved it. And it's truly, a real variety, pure line selection. That's how these innovations in farmers' communities go ahead. And if it is selected and filtered through this community acceptance and appreciation and approval, it is community participatory development, participatory breeding. I think this is in process. This is afoot. This process is afoot, still not dead. Earlier, almost every block had this kind of innovative farmers and breeders. Today, it's almost dead, but nevertheless, it's still not dead altogether.
Sorry to interrupt.
Deval, that's a nice metaphor for the anti-racist movement also, white to red to black.
That's right.
Puneet, sorry, any last, I think there was one more and then we should end.
Yeah, I think Amrita wanted to intervene, but I think there's one last question from Aditi. And then I think, Aditi, please go ahead and unmute yourself and please be brief.
Yeah, Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask that, most of these discussions that I've come across during various seminars and webinars, it seems that climate scientists, the ones who are actually working on the STEM area, they are missing from the discussion. They are conspicuous by their absence. And I am one STEM subject related person. I teach climate science. So, in what way can scientists from the STEM area contribute in any way or get connected in any way and contribute to this movement? Because as much as scientists like to say that it's something very out of bias and science is neutral and all of that, it doesn't seem to be the case when solutions are concerned.
Uh, I have one answer is that no, I being a member of this team of climate scientists team in Germany,
Okay.
we share a common general perception of I'd say despondence, because
Okay.
climate scientists, I'm not the at the forefront, but IPCC scientists, for example, and even
Yeah.
NASA scientists being telling all these kind of things for over 2 decades.
Yes.
They have been telling the same thing over and over these 2 decades to
Yeah.
stop these kind of carbon emission and methane emission and so on and so forth. Nobody listened. None of the governments listened ever. So now they
Yes.
are despondent, and now we have thrown our hands, and we know my own model, which was published in a German journal. We showed that our civilization that we see today, that we understand it today, I mean the industrial civilization, is not going to last longer than 20 more years. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
and because of this, most of the climate scientists are very despondent, saying that no, it's pointless to discuss the things over and over, because none of the
Exactly.
policymakers and the crucial key turners are not listening, and then they're not going to do this. You cannot convince Donald Trump or Modi ever.
Mm. Mm.
Even Manmohan Singh didn't about this. And Trump outrightly rejected that this is a bluff.
Yes.
Climate change is
Yes.
a. So this is the source of despondence. I guess many of the climate scientists actually avoid this kind of webinars or seminars because they have seen through it, and they believe that much of this talking, despite all of these kind of talkings and decision makings, none of these are going to be implemented in fully, and the result is that the climate, I mean, the weather, the sea tide will be rising higher and higher, and the global temperature will rise higher and higher, and all this ice cap will melt further and further, and nothing happened. In fact, we have actually crossed the threshold. Even if we imagine
Yes.
now this moment, every car and every factory stops spewing carbon from this moment right now, it will not change. We have already crossed the threshold. The tipping point is past all along, about 2 years ago. And now the climate scientists are really in despondent hope. And the only thing that we all, not only ecologists, but also climatologists, also plead to the young people: don't beget children. I personally see that, because you are bringing the child to a hell. It will be a crime to beget a child now in this world who would be, when he or she would grow up, it will be a terrible hell to live in. This is not the same world that we are going to bequeath to that child, the next generation. This is really downside of this kind of discussion. I'm sorry that I expressed my despondence myself in these harsh words, but this is exactly most of majority of my friends share the same feeling.
Actually, sir,
All our
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm a professor in a university, and this is something which I have told my students over and over again, that we don't need more papers saying that sea levels are rising. We need people who will work, who can take the science and actually use it to apply as activists, as social activists, or as human beings with a knowledge of science to work out solutions. But again, like I said, I am from a STEM background, and I am completely lost in this conversation because it's new to me. So are there pathways for that was the reason of my question, that whether there are any pathways for STEM scientists to come forward. Like I personally am interested. I want my students to be interested. for that reason, the question was asked. But thank you for your answer. It actually is very much in line with the way I think.
Can
Ashish,
I
would
just
you
add
like
a
to
quick,
quickly?
yeah, I just wanted to add so that we don't end on a note of despondency, which is not, I'm sure that was not Devil's intention. But I think to say that if it weren't for people like you who have been raising these voices of alarm, which of course the Trumps and the Modis are ignoring because it's in the nature of the modern industrialist capitalist system to ignore it. If it weren't for this kind of raising of voices from people like you, we wouldn't see the youth movements that we're seeing today. And to me, even if they don't manage to stop, you're probably absolutely right, tipping point has been reached, etc. If at all we have any hope of being able to survive beyond the collapse, because it's not as if humanity is going to completely disappear. If at all we have some hope of surviving beyond the collapse, it is because the young people today are taking it up in a huge way. And I've always been saying to ourselves and to them, we need this combination of resistance, whether it's the Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion or whatever, along with the documentation and the nurturing of the alternatives. In order for us to, when the collapses are taking place, at least there are some seeds and saplings around for people to be able to rely on, say, okay, here's a pathway by which we can get out of this crisis, because otherwise it's complete collapse, right? It's a total collapse.
Yeah,
so I would say it's this combination of realism of the kind that you're talking about, where we know it's not like there's going to be a miracle in the next 10 years and suddenly we will shift to a earth-friendly society. But if we want also talking these truths, we would not have any hope whatsoever. So I think it's very important for people like you and Aditi to continue speaking out with your science.
Ashish,
Yeah.
I just know, just answer you. I mean, this is a very hopeful thing. I mean, this is the hope that we always bear in the back of our mind, you know, despite all the negativities that we experience in our lives. And this is the reason that I'm still continuing to conserve these 1,400 plus varieties of rice, in the hope that if one or two communities can survive in the remote areas, which away from this industrial civilization, they will be equipped with this, you know, genetic material, which can withstand this, you know, prolonged drought or prolonged flood or seawater incursion and all of these, so that these, you know, the remnants of these human populations, the lost populations, can survive. And those are the populations, and these are the models. If they can rebuild this community with this, you know, the ecological community building with consensus, real democracy, participatory democracy, that would be the model of the political organization. Then of course those will be the last representatives of the human race, the human species, Homo. That would be the last example of the Homo sapiens evolved out of this, you know, and defeating the conquest of Homo economicus.
I
And
think,
Homo sapiens will again survive and conquer. I think that's the last hope that we all have in the back of our mind, despite all the negative things that we see.
I think Mr. Samar Bakchi wanted to say something, sir. If there's something you'd like to say, very quickly, please unmute yourself and go ahead. Mr. Samar Bakchi.
Samartha, you have to unmute.
We can see you.
Yes, Samartha.
We
cannot hear.
I'm a part of the National Alliance for People's Movement. Now, I think the discussion that took place just now, that was my question. That we are at a point in human history when we hear that the sixth mass extinction is coming. At this point, I think that we have to think about what kind of society you have to bring about. Ashish Kothariji, I was mesmerized by his talk. He gave us example of small constructive activities which are going out in different parts of India and also abroad, like the Rosavas or at different places. But then we have only few years, as Deval said, that we have only few years left to survive. The situation is so bad. So it is struggle and construction, both should go together. Struggle to change the society. I will request Ashish Kothariji to please answer that can we build a new kind of society without equity and justice? Can we really build the kind of society which will not bring in this collapse which you are seeing today, without bringing a society which is with equity and justice? Can we build a society without equity and justice, which will not really make humans extinct from Earth? Can we do that?
Samartha, simple response, no, we
Ashish bhai.
can't. Sorry. Puneet, you were saying something?
No, I was
This
just
is my
saying,
question.
please.
Yeah. So, no, Samartha, I mean, simple response is no, we can't. That's why I was trying to combine sustainability, justice, equality, all of that together. I'm sorry if I was not clear enough. But no, we can't. And I also said that the only way to create the macro change and the critical mass is a combination of resistance and alternatives, constructive alternatives, local to global and horizontally, vertically, whatever. So we absolutely need that. I think if there's any environmentalists who are still around who think only of ecological sustainability and not think of social justice, economic justice, equality, etc., then they should by now have been extinct. But they're around. I know that they're still around. There are still conservationists who feel that the half earth movement. I don't know if many of you have heard of this. There's a half earth movement started by E.O. Wilson, which is saying protect half of earth, like make it protected areas. But there's no vision of how, first of all, why only half earth? Why not the whole earth? And secondly, who will do that? What about the indigenous peoples and other local communities in these so-called protected areas? So unless justice is at the center of all kinds, justice of all kinds, which is why I said rainbow revolution, not just a Green New Deal, I don't think we have even the little hope that we are talking about right now will be gone forever.
Ashish, I have a small one-liner for you. I mean, you just mentioned about your last slide that we need a revolution of multiple use. Yesterday, Samita gave a brilliant presentation on queering ecologies, queering the common. I'm sure if you use the word in your rainbow revolution, I think in one way you would add, you would be more inclusive in all the articulations you're doing.
No, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Actually, in my articles, I've articulated that LGBTQ plus is very much part of that. While speaking, sometimes I don't put all of them together, but you're right. In fact, when I was saying pink, for instance, or even the rainbow itself is a metaphor that's adopted from the queer, the queer movement, the LGBTQ plus movement. So yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
I think that's been a great session, and I would like to apologize to Apsar and Debjit for sort of letting it go on, but I think it was important and nobody should have any qualms about it. I would also like to apologize to the few participants who still had questions, but we are 1 hour over the deadline, but I think that's a good sign that these were productive discussions. I would like to request Debjit sir to please conclude and give a vote of thanks to our speakers and the participants who are still around.
As a co-organizer on behalf of RLS, Grain and Living Farms, I would like to express our deep gratitude to Ashish ji, Debolda, Dr. Regina, Dr. Shamhita, Paul Divakar ji, Lisi, who was there yesterday, the child climate activist John and Ridhima couldn't join. Thank you so much. And to the participants, to the delegates who have contributed enormously by raising very, very relevant questions. I think it was a small effort to contribute to the ongoing, our collective efforts in different parts of the country and outside, wherever we are working, to help each other, to confront each other, and to continue the work. Let me express my personal gratitude to Regina for raising that question. And that question makes me sometimes nervous by thinking that how far I am colluding with the power structure in reinforcing it. While working with Adivasi communities, that's a question which I'm always being very careful. I am not from an Adivasi community. I am not from a farming community, and yet I am working. I'm so careful and so nervous, Regina, that what is the extent that I'm colluding with the structure, with the power, with the violence, and that's a responsibility I guess I have for myself. I need to be careful about the people with whom I work so that we don't continue to perpetuate the system which we are confronting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Devjit
Thank
sir.
you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Ashish
Thank
ji,
you so
Regina,
much.
and Deval. And thank you, Afsar, if you're still there.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you,
Puneet, if you
Samita
can
ma'am.
share the recording once you have it with you.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we would be uploading it on YouTube soon as we are able
Okay.
to. And yeah, and we would reach out to you all once it's done, to all the participants and the speakers. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you so
Deval,
much.
Afsar, Devjit, Regina.
Thanks, Ashish.
Good to see you all here.
Everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Afsar.
Okay, so I'm ending the meeting.